The Battle of Hong Kong remains a deeply underestimated and tragically misrepresented chapter in Canadian military history. It was not merely a battlefield defeat, but the genesis of prolonged, horrific experiences of slave labor and mistreatment for thousands of surviving prisoners of war. For decades, the official narrative often obscured the truth, placing undue blame on the soldiers themselves. Yet the reality was far more complex, marked by profound strategic miscalculations, a critical lack of preparation for this specific theatre of war, and immense enduring suffering. In the years leading up to 1941, Canada's relationship with Japan was surprisingly accommodating to some within the media. A $9 million trade surplus fostered an initial favorable stance. Some Canadian outlets even portrayed Japan's expansion as bringing order and good government to a region they characterized by disorder and rapine. This perception softened public understanding of Japan's aggressive ambitions. Meanwhile, Europe dominated British strategic thinking. As early as 1937, British military assessments redirected crucial naval resources from the China Station to counter threats from Germany and Italy in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. This created a dangerous vulnerability in Asian defences. Major General Arthur Grayset, commanding British troops in China, overestimated Hong Kong's defensibility. Despite his lobbying for reinforcements, the War Office refused to provide adequate support, leaving the colony critically understaffed. The establishment of the Tripartite Pact, linking Germany, Japan, and Italy, further emboldened Japanese expansionism. Vichy France's concessions, allowing Japanese aerodromes in northern Vietnam, underscored the growing threat. Canada responded with economic pressure, imposing bans on oil and other strategic materials to Japan, further escalating tensions. In this climate, Prime Minister Mackenzie King's government faced internal pressures. English-speaking politicians eager for Canada to gain battle laurels pushed for a contribution, reassured by military advice from Canada's chief soldier, Major General Harry Crerar, of no military risk for what was presented as mere garrison duty. King agreed to the British request for troops. This decision over deeper concerns about potential conscription and casualties. The selected units were the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers. Critically, these battalions were categorized as not recommended for deployment due to insufficient training or recent employment. While their training was comparable to other Allied forces of 1941, their equipment was severely lacking, few trucks and universal carriers, and almost no mortars, with what little training existed often occurring during their voyage. This directly challenges the long-held myth that Canadians were simply poorly trained. It was not incompetence on the part of the soldiers, but a profound lack of resources and a misjudgment by command. Conversely, Japanese military planning was meticulously thorough. Extensive training in camouflage and infiltration, supported by a well-established spy network, prepared them for a swift victory against a poorly defended Hong Kong. Lieutenant General Takashi Sakai, commander of the Japanese 23rd Army, oversaw this detailed preparation, with his field commander, Major General Takeo Into, training his men specifically for infiltration. In November 1941, Sea Force, comprising 1974 Canadian troops, departed for Hong Kong aboard the troopship Awaitia. Among them was 17-year-old Royal Rifleman Bill McWhirter, who, like many, had enlisted out of a sense of adventure, a genuine belief in fighting fascism, or the simple economic security the military offered during the Depression era. Their journey, with stops in Honolulu and Manila, offered a deceptive calm. Upon arrival in Hong Kong on November 16, 1941, they were quartered in the Sham Shui Po barracks. The well-built huts contrasted sharply with the absence of Western latrines, a stark early indication of the unfamiliar and often unsanitary conditions that awaited them. Little did they know, this quiet before the storm was rapidly drawing to a close. The strategic vulnerabilities, the underestimation of the enemy, and the unpreparedness of the defenses had set the stage for a tragic destiny. The illusion of peace shattered abruptly on December 7, 1941, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Just hours later, on December 8, the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong commenced. Initial British intelligence had consistently misjudged Japanese capabilities, especially their aptitude for night operations and infiltration. This contributed to critical strategic blunders. British General Maltby, the overall commander, dismissed Japanese border guards as scruffy, lazy, and uninterested, a sentiment reflecting a dangerous complacency. His reliance on outdated defense plans would prove disastrous. At dawn on December 8th, air raids began targeting Kaitaka Aerodrome. Simultaneously, Japanese forces infiltrated and crossed the Shamchun River. Lieutenant Aimei, leading small units of the 230th Infantry Regiment, demonstrated the unexpected tactical prowess that would characterize the entire campaign. His men, spirits burning with determination and hope, moved swiftly, aided by split-toed, rubber-soled sneakers that offered stealth compared to the hobnailed boots of the British. The main defensive position on the mainland was the Gin Drinkers Line, an 11-mile stretch that Major General Greystad had once believed defensible, with just 2 additional battalions. However, it was a half-completed, badly situated, and run-down line, particularly vulnerable at night. Its fixed defences were deplorable. A 1935 study had already highlighted their poor state. Pillboxes featured fixed machine guns, often pointed in the wrong directions, and severely limited anti-personnel mines. Only 39 protected crucial points. The 2nd Royal Scots, already reduced by malaria, faced the brunt of the initial assault. Japanese artillery bombardment began at 1 a.m. on December 10th. Colonel Taihichi Doi's reconnaissance of Grassy Hill led him to push for the Shingmun Redoubt. A pivotal strongpoint, overriding regimental boundaries, the Shingmun Redoubt fell rapidly. Corporal M. Breed, Corporal M. Probably, Robertson, defending a pillbox there, experienced the brutal close-quarters fighting and the effectiveness of Japanese hand grenades. The British counterattack to retake the redoubt failed, cementing the loss of this key position and rendering mainland defences untenable. This marked a critical turning point. Reports of Scots and Grenadiers recapturing the Gin Drinkers Line were mere rumours. The Grenadiers were, in fact, covering the Scots' retreat. Major G. Gray, a British engineer, attempted to slow the Japanese advance by destroying bridges. The rapid fall of the mainland defences forced a desperate retreat to Hong Kong Island. The initial British perception of superiority was shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of their tactical and intelligence failings. The difficult fight to come on Hong Kong Island would be undertaken with significantly reduced defences. By noon on December 11th, General Maltby ordered the evacuation of the mainland. As dusk fell, conditions in Kowloon worsened dramatically. Nathan Road, once a famed shopping street, now bore the grim stain of 60 deaths from a single shell. Communal kitchens struggled to feed the almost 1.5 million Chinese residents, while 14,000 sought refuge in air raid shelters. Yet, amidst this devastation, Governor-General Sir Mark Young issued a dismissive communiqué, referring to the Japanese shelling as having mere nuisance value. Events, however, quickly overtook this assessment. Substandard concrete in pillboxes crumbled under Japanese fire, and their artillerists were aided by 5th columnists who supplied detailed maps of British gun emplacements. The defenders were also plagued by 5th columnist activity. Sabotage and intelligence provided to the Japanese significantly aided their advance, compounding the chaos. On December 13th, at 9 a.m., Colonel Takuchi Tada launched a peace mission. Accompanied by 2 Western women and an American journalist, Gwen Du, the Japanese officer sought publicity, offering the British an opportunity to surrender. Major Charles Boxer, the ranking British officer, received the offers. However, Governor Young's absolute refusal to surrender, while perhaps spirited, set the stage for continued brutal fighting. General Sakai, the Japanese commander, was genuinely surprised by the British rejection. The island braced for impact. Japanese air raids intensified, with 6 bombing raids between December 16th and 18th. One single bomb killed 150 civilians. Signalman Blackie Verifold recounted comforting a terrified civilian during one such raid, while Lieutenant Benjamin Prue received communion before another, highlighting the profound human toll and spiritual impact of the siege. Despite prevailing poor weather conditions, and against British preconceptions that the Japanese would not cross the harbour, the invasion of Hong Kong Island began. On December 18th, at 7 p.m., approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers commenced their crossing using requisitioned junks, rafts, and collapsible boats. Colonel Doi described the crossing as a spectacular and grim affair. The Japanese wore coolie black clothing, making them difficult to distinguish in the dark. The Royal Rifles faced the brunt of these initial landings. Lieutenant Colonel William Home, commander of the Royal Rifles, initially dismissed a warning of Japanese landings near Saiwan Fort. Yet, Royal Rifles machine gunners effectively targeted Japanese crossing attempts. Major Wells Bishop, whose earlier reports had been criticized, acted decisively to protect Saiwan Fort. Lieutenant Arthur Scott led a platoon to confront armed men near the fort. From 8 p.m. to midnight, the Royal Rifles made their stand at Saiwan. But by 10 p.m., General Sakai issued the order to invade Hong Kong Island. The fall of the Jewel of the Crown was well underway. The devastation of Hong Kong was now inevitable. As the Japanese gained their foothold on Hong Kong Island in the early hours of December 19th, their tactics proved devastatingly effective. Mirroring Canadian infiltration methods from World War I battles like Vimy Ridge, small units advanced, bypassing strong points and flanking British gun emplacers. They disabled pillboxes before alarms could even be raised. Allied command, particularly General Maltby, was still gripped by complacency, disbelieving that the Japanese would attack over the hilltops. This critical misjudgment left strategic high points dangerously undermanned. The Japanese quickly seized commanding positions. Mount Parker at 1,700 feet, and Jardine's Lookout, which overlooked the crucial Wong Nai Chong Gap. This gap, through which all important roads ran, also housed the headquarters of Brigadier General John Lawson, the Canadian commander. Its capture would effectively split the island's defences. The fighting was brutal. Canadian rifleman Bill McWhirter described their bayonet method: a flat-footed stance, thrusting from the shoulder, then twisting the Lee Enfield to widen the wound. Japanese doctrine, steeped in a reinterpreted Bushido code, taught the way of the warrior as service to the emperor, viewing capture or retreat as disgrace. Hirohito's government had refused to adopt the Geneva Convention, and Japanese soldiers were taught to view the enemy as an avenger come face to face with his father's murderer. This fundamental difference in combat philosophy had horrific consequences. At Saiwan Fort, unarmed British officers and men who had attempted to surrender were massacred, bayoneted one by one with 16-inch blades. The dead and wounded were then tossed into a pit, rocks thrown upon them. Confusion reigned among Allied units. Major Bishop, a Canadian commander, expressed disbelief at reports of Japanese occupations of Saiwan Fort. "Are you trying to tell me that you are manning a fort without arms and a war is going on?" Brigadier Cedric Wallace, commanding East Brigade, assured Bishop the fort was held by friendly troops, a direct contradiction to Bishop's experience of being fired upon. Command confusion escalated. Bishop ordered a counterattack on Saiwan Fort, only for Captain Bompas to arrive, sent by Wallace to lead the same assault. A request for searchlight illumination of Saiwan Fort was denied, as it was under another command. The Japanese, meanwhile, were relentless. They used hand grenades thrown through shelter openings and swiftly moved to strategic high ground. Doy's 2nd Battalion lost one of its 2 anti-tank gun companies in the advance. Yet the momentum was theirs. Sergeant Flash Clayton described his unit's defensive formation: refusing your flank, emphasizing their willingness to fight despite the mounting pressure. But the air was thick with the eerie glow from the fires, the overpowering smell of burning oil, and the rattle of machine gun fire. The sky turned red as blood from fires raging in Victoria. Mount Parker and Jardine's Lookout fell to the Japanese. Lieutenant George Burkitt of the Winnipeg Grenadiers recalled a wild ride to Jardine's Lookout, only to find his platoon engaged in desperate fighting. Colonel Shoji's force suffered nearly 800 casualties, taking Jardine's Lookout alone, a testament to the fierce Canadian resistance. The Salesian Mission, a medical station with 40 personnel, including 8 nursing sisters, became another site of atrocity. Japanese soldiers, under Colonel Tanaka, massacred the wounded and medical staff. Captain Martin Bamphil, head of the mission, witnessed the horror. An interpreter, Honda, engaged Bamphil in detached philosophical discussion, a chilling contrast to the brutality that had just unfolded. Amidst this chaos, individual acts of bravery shone. Sergeant Major John Osborne of the Winnipeg Grenadiers epitomized this. During a Japanese grenade attack on Mount Butler, he threw himself onto a grenade, sacrificing his life to save 6 of his men. It was an act that earned him Canada's first Victoria Cross of the Second World War. Major Ernest Hodkinson led a desperate counterattack on Wong Nei Chong Gap, a force of over 100 men, reinforced with armoured cars. He recounted the battle's brutality, the destruction of his men, and the iron stench of blood from the bodies of fallen soldiers. Exhaustion was profound. Troops had been in the field for 8 days without hot food in 5. The Fifthsiliers, older reservists from the Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Corps, fought bravely at the power station, outnumbered 20-1. Company Quartermaster Sergeant Colin Standish displayed stoic courage, leading men through shelled ground to resupply. The cost was immense. Lieutenant Burkett and his men were killed. Corporal Lindsay Mann died in a POW camp in 1942. The defence, despite moments of incredible valour, was disintegrating. Lawson's headquarters at Wong Nei Chong Gap was surrounded. His last orders to evacuate were quickly issued. The romanticised notion of Lawson dying in a blaze of glory is refuted by eyewitness accounts, which paint a picture of him being quickly overwhelmed. By the evening of December 19th, the situation was critical. Governor Young's broadcast at 8:30 p.m. signalled the dire situation and the end of organised resistance. The island's jewel was crumbling. The defence of Hong Kong had dissolved into a desperate struggle, marked by chaos, exhaustion, and overwhelming odds. By December 20th, 1941, fighting raged around the opulent Repulse Bay Hotel. Here, civilians and military refugees sought shelter in a setting utterly incongruous with the brutality of war. Japanese troops, misidentified despite being observed, had already begun their infiltration. A 10-year-old boy woke his father to report Japs outside an early, unexpected sighting. Lieutenant Benjamin Proof of the Royal Rifles led a dramatic counterattack. He engaged a Japanese officer who was slapping a captured soldier, his Tommy gun's blast sending the officer into a pirouette that ended in a silly, lifeless fall. Japanese soldiers sought shelter behind the concrete walls of castles. Brigadier Wallace, still commanding East Brigade, continued to criticize Canadian troops for perceived slowness and lack of initiative. His war diary entries reveal a dismissive view, ignoring the realities of enemy fire and the terrain. Heavy 45-pound radio sets were impractical on the steep rocky ground, forcing reliance on runners, who often faced mortal danger. At 10 a.m. on December 20th, a shell explosion mortally wounded Colonel Patrick Hennessy, a high-ranking officer. His horrific injuries, legs held only flesh and sinew, and his pleas to lift my head up provided a graphic testament to the shelling's impact. Sergeant George MacDonnell of the Royal Rifles exemplified individual initiative. He led a crucial mission to silence a Japanese artillery battery near Tai Tam Tuk Reservoir, moving with men carrying rifles, mortars, and Bren guns through water catchment. He engaged in a direct duel with a machine gunner, his experience so close he could hear bullets chirping less than an inch from his ear. Despite such bravery, the situation was grim. The Japanese had cut off the water supply from Tai Tam Reservoir, and essential resources, ammunition, food, rest, were critically low. Major Home, a senior Canadian officer, confronted Wallace about his battalion being dead beat, only for Wallace to take offence at the phrase Canadian lives and advise Home to rest and have a sleep before acting on a big problem not of any urgency. This stark disconnect between frontline reality and senior command perspective was devastating. Amidst the fighting, Padre Uriah Leahy, an honorary captain with the Winnipeg Grenadiers, faced harrowing choices. After his shelter was shelled and shrapnel struck Grenadier John Gunn in his back, buttocks, and testicles, Leahy waved a white flag, throwing the men's guns and bayonets out the window. But the Japanese, disregarding the Geneva Convention, ripped the list of wounded from Leahy's hand. His desperate plea to the injured boys, "If you can walk, for God's sake, walk," underscores the brutal reality. Leahy himself was repeatedly spared and eventually released, a rare exception. The battle raged. On December 21st, a failed attack on Red, Notting and Bridge Hills led to heavy casualties. Major Harry Hook's attempt to break into the Wong Nei Chong Gap was an expensive failure. Every officer in his company, the company sergeant major, both platoon sergeants, both lance sergeants, 2 corporals and a lieutenant in charge of an attached mortar section, was killed or wounded. 98 men went into battle, 29 became casualties. The Japanese seized Notting and Sugarloaf Hills, shattering the defensive line. The Royal Rifles, who had been pushed back from Saiwan on the 19th, and attacked Wong Nei Chong Gap on the 20th, were now fighting on these new fronts. The HKVDC men, in their yellow fatigues, made easy targets. The atrocities continued. At Overbay's house, captured soldiers were left to choke and burn to death. At Ucliffe Castle, prisoners were executed, then bayoneted as they lay dying. Japanese soldiers pulled rings, necklaces, and watches from civilians, their primitive bayonet tactics now an ingenious, effortless, and economical device for torturing their captives. The Repulse Bay Hotel itself became a desperate holdout. Before evacuation, hundreds of bottles of booze were destroyed. Inside a drainage culvert, Prue found a small crucifix, which he passed back from man to man, a poignant moment of shared faith amidst the impending defeat. By daybreak, on December 25, 1941, Christmas Day, resistance had become futile. Governor Young's signal to London had conveyed the dire military situation, questioning the possibility of continued resistance and hinting at surrender. The Admiralty insisted on continued resistance and the destruction of oil installations, but the human cost was too high. The systematic bayoneting and torture of the captured and wounded were stark violations of human decency. Lieutenant Colonel Home, commander of the Royal Rifles, faced a profound moral dilemma. His unit was exhausted, decimated by 50 hours of continuous fighting. Home himself had nearly mutinied, refusing orders from Wallace to continue suicidal attacks, prioritizing the lives of his men. Despite a brief tactical victory with the recapture of Stanley Mound by the Canadians, the overwhelming force of the Japanese could not be stemmed. The Royal Rifles had suffered immense casualties, and Home's desire to withdraw was born of a grim reality. Resistance officially ceased. The decisive surrender on Christmas Day, 1941, marked the end of the battle and the beginning of the Powder Ball ordeal. The fall of the Jewel of the Crown was complete. For the 1,700 Canadians who survived the brutal 18-day battle, the war was far from over. The surrender on Christmas Day marked the beginning of a second, prolonged battle, a fight for survival in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps. Their ordeal was horrific. They were subjected to systematic starvation, disease, and forced slave labor in almost 20 POW camps across Hong Kong and Japan. Locations like North Point, Shamshipo, Aoyama, Niigata, Narumi, Omino, Tsurumi, Kawasaki 3D, and Kai Tak Aerodrome became synonymous with suffering. Guards like Snake's Eyes made concerted efforts to break the will of Canadian prisoners. The conditions were appalling. A 60 by 30-foot hut, referred to as the Black Hole of Hong Kong, held 200 men. The moans of the wounded, the stink of unwashed bodies, and the smell of decaying flesh, made worse by unseasonable heat, were ever present. In 1943, the first Canadian Hell ships transported POWs to Japan, where the forced labor continued in mines and factories throughout 1944. Bill McWhirter's personal diary and memorabilia offer a visceral connection to this harrowing experience, a testament to his resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. The end of World War II on August 15, 1945, brought liberation, but the trauma endured. The consequences of Hong Kong were devastating. Of the 1974 Canadian troops comprising Sea Force, 290 died during the battle itself. An additional 267 died in Japanese POW camps. The Canadian force suffered a 100% casualty rate. All were either killed, wounded, missing, or taken prisoner. This stands in stark contrast to the approximately 40% casualty rate at Dieppe. For the survivors, the years of brutal captivity left profound and lasting trauma, a war that continued long after the fighting stopped. This chapter of Canadian military history remained largely forgotten, often overshadowed by more prominent World War II campaigns in Europe. The simplistic narratives of military failure were challenged by the resilience and suffering of individual soldiers. For decades, the struggle for recognition and compensation for the POWs continued, revealing bureaucratic and political indifference. But the truth eventually emerged. On December 11, 1998, the Canadian government agreed to an ex gratia payment for the forced labor endured by the POW, finally acknowledging their long struggle for restitution and recognition. The story of Hong Kong debunks several persistent myths. The idea that Canadians were poorly trained or incompetent was largely propagated by figures like Brigadier Cedric Wallace, whose war diary is now recognized as a calumny. In reality, while equipment was lacking, their training was comparable to other Allied forces of 1941. Nor were the soldiers naive or solely driven by nationalism. Many were motivated by a genuine sense of threat from fascism, a desire for adventure, or the economic security the military offered during the Depression. Finally, the disaster statistic of 100% casualties does not tell the whole story. It obscures the fact that the defenders fought bravely, inflicted significant casualties on the Japanese, and held out longer than expected. The true ordeal for many was the subsequent, prolonged and brutal POW experience. The Battle of Hong Kong was a tragic illustration of the consequences of strategic misjudgment, underestimation of a formidable enemy, and the immense human cost of war. It stands as a testament to the resilience, suffering, and enduring legacy of those Canadians who fought and endured in a battle that should never be forgotten. That should never be forgotten. But for those who endured, the battle's end brought no peace. Christmas Day, 1941, a date universally associated with goodwill, marked instead an official surrender. Yet for the Japanese, it signaled a green light for unchecked brutality. At Saint Brutality, Stevens College Hospital, on Christmas Day itself, a horrific attack unfolded. Wounded men and medical staff were targeted indiscriminately. 2 men were killed by artillery at St. Stephen's. Rifleman Sidney Skelton miraculously survived. He feigned death amidst the bayoneting of his comrades. Even earlier, on the 23rd of December 1941, atrocities erupted at Overbay's house. Then, at Ucliffe Castle. Here, some 50 other British and Canadians had taken shelter, alongside 150 civilians, including children as young as 4 and 5. These innocents were marched toward Ucliffe Castle. Many were murdered there. Lieutenant W. tweeted, Markey later saw over 50 bodies at Ucliffe Castle. At least 15 had their hands tied behind their backs, captured alive, then destroyed. Lieutenant Charles Johnston witnessed heads chopped off. The wounds were always in the back of the neck. Nurses, too, faced unimaginable horrors. Chinese nurses were thrown on bayoneted bodies. British nurses, Emma Begg among them, were gang-raped and mutilated. Sergeant Major Begg's mental collapse was complete. He found his wife's mutilated body. Sister Mosey, with immense bravery, stepped in front of Japanese soldiers. She protected wounded men from further harm. Survivors of Overbay's house escaped by jumping into the sea. They swam from Repulse Bay Road and Repulse Bay. The previous night, the defense had crumbled under relentless pressure. Major General Maltby himself ordered the final capitulation. At 3:15 p.m. on Christmas Day, the order to cease fighting went out. This followed a chaotic, desperate final stand. Command disunity had plagued the defense. Brigadier Wallace advocated for continued resistance. He criticized the Canadian Royal Rifles commander. Lieutenant Colonel Home repeatedly argued for withdrawal. His battalion was reduced to merely 350 effectives. The Royal Rifles battalion was cut by almost 2/3. He cited exhaustion and overwhelming casualties. The clash between Home and Wallace was intense. Major General Maltby had earlier bawled out Major Bale for withdrawing from a position deemed vital, but later Maltby relented to the grim reality. As the surrender was signed around 5 p.m., a new, terrifying ordeal began for the survivors. Lance Corporal Ross McGavin and Lance Sergeant William Laidlaw joked darkly. "What's the best thing about prison camp food?" McGavin asked. "You get to eat it twice," Laidlaw quipped, a macabre humour for the fate awaiting them. The immediate aftermath of surrender was a scene of desecration. Rifleman John Mackay and Elsie Henderson were found, their eyes, ears and tongues cut out. Japanese forces refused proper burial. Over 160 bodies were placed on a pyre of mattresses. The smell of burning pyre and bodies curled through the air. The lofty code of chivalry often attributed to Japanese forces was a myth. Their conduct was one of studied barbarism. This disregard for human life was immediately evident. The Japanese government had not ratified the Geneva Convention. Though they promised to apply its provisions mutatis mutandis, the reality was starkly different. POW camps were quickly established. Shamshuipo and North Point awaited the defeated. Conditions were deplorable from the start. Shamshuipo's latrine was a few buckets. North Point offered a plank over the seawall. with floating Chinese bodies below. Crap, all over the place, became the norm. Dysentery outbreaks were inevitable. Fly infestations swarmed garbage dumps and decaying corpses. Huts had roofs and walls ripped open by shells. Grenadiers were forced to sleep on bare concrete. Mattresses at North Point crawled with bedbugs. Up to 200 men were crammed into 125 by 18-foot huts. Bunks ranged 5 high. The physical and psychological toll began immediately. That immediate suffering would extend for years for men like Jean-Paul Delam. He spent 3.5 years in a POW camp. Later, Dallin opened his hardware store in June 1946. But by February 1947, he sought medical care for eye trouble and a persistent cough. His tuberculosis was a direct legacy of his captivity. This deliberate cruelty defined much of the POW experience. SS Brigadefuhrer Kurt Meyer had ordered his men to deny quarter on D-Day, June 6, 1944. His troops murdered 23 Canadians. Meyer was later charged with the murder of 55 Canadians. Even Canada's own government, under Prime Minister W.L. Mackenzie King, was lukewarm on war crimes prosecution. Ottawa instructed Vincent Massey, Canada's High Commissioner in London, on this view in July 1943. A War Crimes Advisory Committee in December 1943 argued against trying senior Axis leaders. Major General Christopher Vokes convened the Canadian military court that tried Kurt Meyer. But the brutal conditions were widespread, especially in the east. Lieutenant Masao Uemori, a camp commandant, was implicated in the beatings and deaths of 79 Canadians. Yet, a letter from Captain Reed, describing Uemori as fair and considerate, impacted his sentence. 7 other guards convicted in Tokyo received sentences ranging from 4 to 12 years. Major George Puddicombe successfully prosecuted several Japanese war criminals in Hong Kong. The crimes were not limited to the camps. Major General Ryosaburo Tanaka was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His prosecution stemmed from attacking a medical station and ordering deaths of a doctor and others. 4 grenadiers were executed after escaping Shamshuipo. Colonel Isao Tokunaga and Captain Shonkichi Saito were prosecuted for their deaths. Colonel Tokunaga's defense of following orders was explicitly rejected for torture and execution of 8 men. Dr. Tokur and execution of 8 men. Shunkichi Saito, for denying medical care and falsifying records, was sentenced to death. General Ito received 12 years for the murders of 7 British soldiers. One of the most notorious figures was Kanao Inoue, the Kamloops Kid. Canadian-born, he was tried as a Japanese soldier for war crimes and treason. Inoue was prosecuted for beating Captain John Norris and Major Frank Atkinson. He also subjected Lamsik, Ramphel Gillot, and Mrs. Afrenk, Ramphel Gillot, and Mrs. Absolute, Mary Power to water torture. Mrs. 8. Mary Power endured more than 6 hours of being hung by her hands. On the 19th of November 1946, confirming authority ruled Kanao Inoue should not have been tried in a military court. Despite this, Inoue was executed on the 25th of August 1947. These atrocities were compounded by the chaotic initial defense. Brigadier Cedric Wallace, author of A Critical War Diary, detailed shortcomings. He noted the Royal Rifles of Canada's portable double-T sets had not arrived. They were trained on weapons before their arrival in the field. The unit's thick woolen battle dress was far too heavy for such operations. They had no conception of field communication and were unable to lay field cables. The Royal Rifles lost almost all field telephones. Wallace took over command of the Royal Rifles of Canada on the 14th of December 1941. He immediately witnessed disorganization. On 18,010, 41, Wallace experienced his first shock. C Company of the RRC, under Major Bishop, failed to react well to shelling and mortar fire. By the 20th of December 1941, the RRC showed disorganization and failures in intercommunication. This was against Violet Hill and Middle Spur. Despite this, on the 21st of December 1941, the RRC fought with determination in some areas, but still showed slowness up hills and lack of communication. By the 23rd of December 1941, a company of the RRC withdrew into the prison club. instead of their designated positions. The RRC's final demand to surrender prematurely was cited by Wallace on the 24th of December 1941. This period of initial defeat only set the stage for the true horror of captivity. The initial Maltby report, critical of Canadian training, was later toned down. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery intervened to soften the criticism. Major Young, for instance, was initially accused of being the worse for drink. That charge was later omitted from published accounts. Even accusations that Commanding Officer Home wore Major Forrester's boots left veterans speechless. Home, notably, was promoted to Brigadier General upon return to Canada in 1945. These debates highlight the complexities of assigning blame. The focus should remain on the individual soldier. The ones who became part of the 1,505 British Empire soldiers who died, many in the Battle of Hong Kong or in POW camps. 444 graves hold the remains of unidentified soldiers at Sai Wan Military Cemetery. Over 200 Canadians are listed on the Sai Wan Memorial. The human cost was immense and personal. Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Major Wells Bishop earned the Distinguished Service Order for his skillful retreat. Corporal Derek Ricks received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Company Quartermaster Sergeant Colin Standish earned the Distinguished Service Medal. Their bravery stood in stark contrast to the unfolding atrocities. The sinking of the Lisbon Maru became a stark turning point. In early morning, the 1st of October, the US Norm 2 submarine grouper torpedoed the vessel. 1816 British POWs had boarded the Lisbon Maru on the 25th of September 1942. Near dawn, the 2nd of October, the Lisbon Maru sank. More than 840 POWs drowned or were shot to death. They were tied in holds, Japanese guards opening fire as they tried to escape, kicking and stepping on fingers of men trying to climb aboard. A bucket of urine was lowered to exhausted POWs. A cruel joke. Many suffered starvation neurosis. The Regina Leader Post's headline, Hong Kong Overcome Glorious Canadian Chapter, 101 Saskatchewan men rang hollow. Far from glory, there was a brutal liquidation order for internees. Women, children, nuns to be given poisoned rice. The war's end, marked by the atomic bombings, provided a grim salvation. Many surviving POWs believed the atomic bombs saved their lives. The bombings obviated the need for an invasion of the home islands. This final terrible act brought freedom for many. Though the trauma endured, Canada's own reckoning with wartime decisions continued. In September 1988, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney officially apologized for the internment of Japanese Canadians. The long shadow of Hong Kong stretched for decades.